Hello, it's Mr. Ripka reading Neruda during Corona, and we have reached poem LXXIII. We have reached poem 73. There's only one more left, poem 74, and that one's going to come tomorrow. So let us go ahead and begin. Last time in poem LXXII 72, he brought up imagery that he has brought up before, and interestingly enough, it was seasonal imagery. Right? He starts by saying last time, if all rivers are sweet, where does the sea get its salt? And then after that, he says, how do the seasons know they must change their shirt? And then after that, he goes in, why so slowly in winter? Right? This is last time's poem 72. We're doing poem 73 today, but it's connected. And so he's talking about winter there and how the roots know they must climb toward the light and then greet the air with so many flowers and colors. And then he gets into spring. So he started with winter. Why so slowly in winter? Has a couple questions. And then says, is it always the same spring who revives her role? And that's where we last left off with poem 72, his question about spring. I bring this up because it seems like poem 72, 73, and the last poem of this great work of questions, poem 74, have to do with seasons. So it's something to think about. A book that starts in poem 1 with, why don't the immense airplanes fly around with their children? That's the first question of the whole book. And which yellow bird fills its nest with lemons? All these flying kind of imagery. And then he has, of course, throughout more imagery of seasons, and he ends the work with seasons. So it's something to think about for perhaps why Neruda ends his book of questions with seasonal imagery. And he starts with winter in poem 72, brings up spring toward the end of poem 72, and then it seems like, as we're going to see today with the 5 questions in poem 73, that he seems to go from spring into summer, though he doesn't mention summer, and then the last question brings up autumn. So then you're getting winter, spring, perhaps some summer, and then the last question is autumn. Kind of like the last question in 72 had to do with spring and then moves into 73. The last question in 73 has to do with autumn, and it moves into 74 with autumnal imagery. That is imagery having to do with the season of autumn. So one thing to think about next time we meet and read poem 74 is, why does Neruda end this great work not only with imagery of seasons and change, but why end with autumn? What is it about autumn? But before we get to that, let's go ahead and read the questions for today, which seem to be more about springtime and summertime. Here they are in Espanol. Poem LXXIII. ¿Quién trabaja más en la tierra? ¿El hombre o el sol cereal? Entre el abeto y la amapola, ¿a quién la tierra quiere más? You heard that word más twice there, something more, más. Entre las orquídeas y el trigo, ¿para cuál es la preferencia? There you heard the word entre, which was used before in the poem, in the second question. Entre el abeto was the second question, and this one is entre las orquídeas. So you can see there's a movement. You had the mas in the first, and then he grabs the mas to use it in the second, but he introduces entre in the second and uses that to start the third question. The fourth question says, ¿Por qué tanto lujo a una flor y un oro sucio para el trigo? You might have heard that trigo word, which was brought up in the third question, entre las orquídeas y el trigo. And then this one says, ¿Por qué tanto lujo a una flor y un oro sucio para el trigo? So you can see he's bringing in the words from the previous sentence and perhaps moving the theme or the idea forward. We'll talk about what trigo means, of course, later. Well, I'll just tell you now. It means wheat, like the wheat, like the cream of wheat, but really it's the, not cream of wheat, just the wheat plant itself. And then the last one he brings not entre, but intra. Entre means in between, like intercontinental, in between the continents, right? Entre, E-N-T-R-E. Intra is a verb meaning enter. So there's a little, maybe a hint of that. But then here's the question. Intra el otoño legalmente o es una estación clandestina? It's a fun word, clandestina, clandestine. And there you heard the word, of course, otoño, as he moves into autumn imagery. And of course, the next poem, the last poem we're going to do tomorrow, will then continue the theme of autumnal imagery. So let's see what he's saying here in English. He says, ¿Quién? He starts the first question of poem 73 with ¿Quién? Who? Trabaja más. Who works more or harder? Más. En la tierra, on the earth. El hombre, a human. O el sol cereal, or the sun. But it's a certain type of sun, a cereal sun, and so it's almost like a cereal sun, not a serial killer, but like the grain, a cereal. So the translator says, who works harder on earth, a human or the grain's sun? The big ball of fire in the sky. He likes to talk about that type of sun. I think he uses it much more often than the S-O-N, sun, as in the child. So that one is, who works harder on the earth, a human or the grain's sun? What is a grain's sun? Is it different than the palm tree's sun or the plum's sun or the sunflower's sun? I don't know. Another way to think of it is the cereal sun. That's kind of how it is in the Spanish. You have el sol, the noun, and cereal. So the grain sun, the cereal sun. We'll continue. The next one, if you remember, started with entre. It's between the fir tree, el abeto, and the poppy. He likes to talk about the poppy. That is la amapola. I'm sure he just likes the way the word sounds, amapola. Sounds fun. And then we have a quien again, to whom. Okay, so to whom. So we had between the fir tree and the poppy. A quien, whom does the earth love more? Oh, the fir tree or the poppy. This seems to me like it's late spring, early summer imagery, though he hasn't mentioned summer. We are talking about the sun and the grain growing, and now we have a fir tree and a poppy, and these things I think normally would flower more in the summer than in the spring, at least the poppy. The next question kind of continues this idea of whom the earth loves more by starting again with entre. Between the orchids and the wheat, which does it favor? That's the question. Of course, the it there must be the earth, right? It must go back. Which does it, the earth, favor? The orchids or the wheat? That seems related to the grain up there. Who works harder on the earth, a human or the grain's sun? Then we had between the fir tree and the poppy, whom does the earth love more? And now we have between the orchids and the wheat, which does it favor? Yeah, it's kind of interesting because the orchid is a very pretty, elaborate flower, right? And not that wheat isn't elaborate or pretty in its own way, but I think most of the time it's considered a little more dull than a flower, which is, I think the next question is related to that too, because he says, why a flower with such opulence and wheat with its dirty gold? So I don't think he's saying, why does the earth favor the orchid over the wheat? Really, he's just asking, does it? Does the earth favor? And then he's wondering, why? Why does the earth or nature have a flower of such opulence, and then with wheat, it's dirty gold. It's oro sucio. So we heard the word wheat twice right there, right? El trigo. And then we had cereal in number 1. So there's this sort of grain and wheat kind of thing, and then flowering things like poppies and all that. Curious, curious. So he's wondering who works harder, whom does the earth love more, whom does the earth prefer, and then curious why the flour with such opulence, and then the wheat with its dirty gold. And then the last question, he now segues into autumn. He says, does autumn enter legally, or is it an underground season? An underground season, I love it. Clandestine season. It kind of comes in from the underground and sneaks. Why autumn? Why is he wondering about the legality of autumn? Something to think about. Is it an underground season? There's a lot of harvest in autumn. We'll talk more about that tomorrow, of course. But it also is a time, if we think about it, the beginning of the dying. There's this great harvest, but it's the harvest of perhaps almost the last harvest, and then the winter comes and the dying comes. So we're going to wrap this up. Poem LXXIII 73. Mr. Pablo Neruda. I'm going to read the 5 questions in English, and then we're going to say goodbye for now. It says, who works harder on earth, a human or the grain's son? Between the fir tree and the poppy, whom does the earth love more? Between the orchids and the wheat, which does it favor? Why a flower with such opulence and wheat with its dirty gold? Does autumn enter legally, or is it an underground season? Whew. What does he mean by this? Autumn entering legally, or is this an underground season? Well, to find out, you're going to have to tune in tomorrow as we explore poem LXXIV, poem 74, which will continue the autumnal theme and perhaps help us answer that question. Does autumn enter legally, or is it an underground season? I hope you can join me for the finale next episode of Ripka reads Neruda during Corona. Thanks again, and I will see you then.